Leah, Kate, and Maggie Fox carried out an elaborate prank for 40 years, convincing audiences that they could communicate with spirits. Welcome back to the Church History Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Lee Siemens. I hope you're all having a wonderful November. It's been really wonderfully busy here. Yesterday, the ladies from my wonderful Bible study decorated our church for Christmas. It was such a great time. Also, I've been busy prepping for a speech I'm giving tomorrow on euthanasia here in Canada. And for those of you who don't know, I live here in Canada, and it's absolutely crazy what's happening here in Canada with euthanasia. And I'm going to post that on my website, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, but it's not going to probably come out until tomorrow. So we'll see if you're able to listen to it or not. But it's a great talk. And also, if you're looking for someone to come and speak to your church or to your group, I talk about abortion, I talk about euthanasia, I talk about great history, church history, and lessons we can learn from it. There's a lot of speeches that I give. So if you're looking for someone to speak, I would love to come and help you with that. Also, I've been hearing from people who've ordered my book, and I'm glad that so many people are liking it. If you haven't read the first book, remember you can order both of them. The Church is Born, which talks about the beginning of the church, and The Church is Corrupted, which talks about the time leading up to the Reformation. Here is a short commercial for my newest book. Today, November 5th, my new book, The Church is Corrupt, is available for order. I previously published the book, The Church is Born, which was part 1 in our series, and that delved into the creation of the church. But my second book picks up where the first one left off. It offers a unique and insightful perspective on the church's journey. Discover the rich history of the church, its triumphs, its failures, and its heroes. In this second book in the series on church history, we journey through the pivotal moments that shaped Christianity as we know it. From the foundational theology of the early church to the inspiring lives of great men and women who boldly stood for their faith. Explore the church's role during the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and even the discovery of America. Learn how over centuries the church began to slowly lose its way, setting the stage for the monumental changes just before the Protestant Reformation. With each chapter highlighting a different story, you're going to be inspired by the heroes of our faith and challenged to reflect on the lessons from the church's successes and its stumbles. Whether you're a seasoned historian or just beginning your exploration of church history, this book offers valuable insights for everyone. Both books, The Church is Born and The Church is Compromised, are available on Amazon for you to order. So if you haven't gotten the first book, why not get both today and delve into the comprehensive understanding of the church's journey? This season, we discuss new religions and theologies that emerged in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And today, we're discussing when talking about spirits entered the church, and it's a wild story. There was a time in church history when the idea that someone might talk to the dead or communicate with the dead would lead to being called a witch. And during the Inquisition, that was not something you wanted to be called. I did an episode on burning witches, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. By the 1840s, though, the church had changed. And here's the story that made the biggest change. In 1848, the Fox family moved into this small house in New York, not knowing that their lives were about to take a strange and unexpected turn. The family, John and Margaret Fox, were Methodists, and their daughters, Catherine and Margaretta, had previously lived in the small village in Prince Edward County, Ontario, where Mr. Fox had owned a farm, and now they had moved to New York. After settling into their new home, there was rumors that began to spread. People in the area believed the house they had bought was haunted, and according to local legends, a man had been murdered in the house, and some believed that his spirit was still there. In 1848, a simple prank by the two young sisters, Maggie and Kate, eventually ignited a wave of interest in communicating with the dead, and that ended up spreading across America and even all of Europe. One night, the sisters claimed that they heard mysterious rapping sounds on the wall and on the furniture. They wanted to explore this mystery, so the sisters responded to the knocks, and they claimed that the unseen spirit answered back. Soon, neighbors wanted to hear and witness what these sisters were claiming. And when they came, the neighbors said they could hear the knocks as well. And they were convinced the girls had somehow learned how to communicate with spirits. As the excitement grew, the sisters were sent to nearby Rochester, where their older sister Leah lived, and they continued their pranks in that city. People were surprised that these rappings, as they called them, had followed them even to Leah's house. And that is where they met a Quaker couple. Amy and Isaac Post were a Quaker couple with strong ties to social reform movements. They were part of the abolition movement and women's rights, and they welcomed these girls into their home. This couple was convinced that these knockings, as they called it, were real. And the Posts, this Quaker couple, began spreading the story amongst their friends. And soon, the entire Quaker community was obsessed with these girls. By 1849, just a year later, these sister and their older sister Leah, who had joined them, were performing their spirit act for paying audiences, first in their hometown and then in big cities like New York City. Although some people said these girls are frauds, most were loving their performances and were convinced that they were watching these girls communicate with spirits. On November 14th, 1849, the Fox sisters held their first public demonstration of spirit rapping at a hall in Rochester, New York. This wasn't just an ordinary gathering. It was the first paid event. And this started a new era of public seances and spiritualist performances. And word began to spread really quickly. The sisters began to draw really huge audiences. People were fascinated by the idea of communicating with spirits. People in the audience were allowed to ask questions, and many of the questions they asked during these seances were really lighthearted and even trivial. They asked questions about love or predictions about railway stocks. Still, the sessions were popular and continued to grow. The girls became famous. As the Fox sisters gained fame, they began performing seances for some of New York's most prominent figures, from well-known publishers and politicians to even famous novelists. People took an interest in these young mediums and began helping them gain access to so-called high society. Soon the girls were talking and meeting with the elitists of society. These people wanted to communicate with the dead. As the girls dived deeper into this world of spirits, they also began to fall apart. Both Kate and Margaretta began to drink, and that drinking would contribute to personal struggles. But while in the background they had drinking problems and other problems with their relationships, what everyone saw when they saw the two sisters were stars in the world of spiritualism. They captured people's imaginations from really all walks of life, and their influence started a movement that lasted even until today. By the 1850s, people were starting to figure out that the sisters were faking the whole thing, and some critics, including a doctor named E.P. Longworth and a pastor named Reverend Austin, suspected that these raps were not supernatural. Eventually, the girls confessed. The sounds were all part of just an elaborate prank. They were using techniques like cracking their knuckles or other joints to produce mysterious knocks. But by the time they admitted this, the movement had launched and it was unstoppable. Spiritualism had become widespread, drawing followers from all over who wanted to connect with the spirit world. Even after they confessed that the whole thing was a lie, the belief in spiritualism persisted. In 1851, a relative of the girls, named Mrs. Norman Culver, signed a statement revealing that she had actually helped the sisters by touching them to signal them when to make the raps. And she also claimed they had shown her how to make the sounds by snapping their toes, ankles, and their knees. While this relative's confession did add fuel for the skeptics, other people continued to believe what the sisters were doing. The Fox Sisters show sparked the beginning of the Spiritualist movement. This was a belief that people could communicate with the dead. Spiritualism became more than just being curious. It merged with entertainment. And today it still exists. People flocked to the shows from the Fox Sisters, and soon other mediums were also starting their own shows. And they all claimed to have a direct line to the spirit world. Soon these shows added things like eerie lighting, music, and table tipping in order to enhance the experience. This grew even more whenever there was a tragic event, such as the Civil War. And during that time, families wanted comfort because they missed their loved ones. Even people like Mary Todd Lincoln, who was the wife of President Abraham Lincoln, sought help from one of these spiritualists. And even Queen Victoria in England held seances, hoping to communicate with deceased family members. For these people, as well as many others, they looked for help from the seances in order to grieve. This was a change of, instead of going to the church or to God or to the Bible, to seek help through grief from God. Now, these Fox sisters, they held lives that seemed great, amazing, famous, but in the end, it was tragic. The eldest sister, Leah, first lost her husband, who died, so then she married a Wall Street banker, and she enjoyed some stability. But her younger sister faced horrible paths. They had problems with alcoholism, problems in their families. Margaret married a man who was a Catholic, and he convinced her to convert to Catholicism and to leave all of the spirit things behind. However, as soon as he passed away in 1857, she returned to her life as a medium. Kate traveled to England in 1871. Her trip was funded by a wealthy New York banker. And in England, she conducted seances exclusively for only prominent, wealthy people. She eventually married H.D. Jenkin, who was a London barrister, and he also believed in spiritualism. However, after his death in 1881, she was left a widow with 2 sons. All the sisters struggled with alcoholism, and there was a lot of concern with Kate not having ability to care for her children properly. Near the end of her life, Margaret returned back to her faith, and she began to say that all of her playing around with spiritualism was harmful, and playing with these powers was harmful. Kate passed away in 1892, and a year later, Margaretta passed away in 1893. Today, all 3 of the Fox sisters are married in Brooklyn. The Fox sisters' belief in communicating with the dead sparked this widespread spiritualism movement, and it impacted not only society, but also the church. We see that today as it's still seen as a form of entertainment. But as their ideas spread, some traditional Christian denominations faced challenges. People began to challenge the church on their teachings about death and the afterlife. Most churches taught that communicating with spirits was against biblical principles. They showed them scriptures that clearly says engaging with mediums or spiritism is wrong. But the Fox sisters' influence created this cultural fascination with communicating with the dead, and that led to the growth of spiritualism in America and Europe. The church struggled at this time and faced this dilemma because speaking out against this was making some people leave the church. People were looking for help with their grief, and unfortunately, many people saw this in talking to spirits. It drew people away from Orthodox Christian beliefs, and it led to a rise of new spiritual practices outside of the church's influence. Today, there are churches and movements that practice things that resemble elements of spiritualism. Some churches teach even that you can go to a Christian grave and have some of their spiritual power passed to you in the way that Elijah and Elisha interacted with the double portion. They call this grave soaking or mantle grabbing. There are churches that emphasize God's power through prophetic words, visions, and healings, but some of those go farther into talking to spirits. It's important for the church to have these difficult conversations and to have discernment and boundaries when it comes to some of these spiritual things. In today's society, fortune tellers, tea readers, and witchcraft have become very popular and trendy. In fact, there's whole Instagram accounts for witches today. Since the Fox sisters in the 1800s, it's only continued to grow and become more popular with every decade. Today, almost everyone knows their sign, or they're mapping out the stars. As Christians, it's important to remember we need to have these discernment and boundaries and make sure we're not participating in things that are part of witchcraft, even if it is just a joke or a prank. We have one more episode in this season. Next week, we're going to discuss Jehovah's Witnesses, and then we're going to start with our Christmas episode. In my last episode, I ended talking about how I was going to decorate my house for Christmas, and some people were very angry about that. Well, I'll tell you what, my house is very wonderfully decorated for Christmas, and I love it. And I know there are some historical questions about the church and Christmas, and I'm going to talk all about that in December. So stay tuned to listen to that. In the meantime, don't forget to get my 2 books, The Church is Born and The Church is Corrupted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. We release new content every Monday. And don't forget to check out our website at lauraleesiemens.com for more information and additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week as we continue our journey through the incredible history of the church.